How do you get multiple stakeholders to agree to do literally anything in a business? It's one of the biggest problems. And when you're trying to do product management, somebody's got to set a direction and say, go this way. Well, in a large company, you can't get everybody to agree and nobody wants to take any risk. In a small company, everybody has lots of ideas and you've got to make a decision and you've got to go quickly to survive. It's a challenge on both sides. Today, we're talking to Stephen, who's got 5 decades of experience of building technology products, about this problem and about how AI is changing how we do product management. Check out today's episode of Product Driven. To survive and thrive, you must adopt a product-driven mindset. And we're back for another episode of Product Driven. This is your host, Matt Watson. Today, very excited to be joined by Stephen Pollack. He's a longtime veteran of the industry, done a lot of different startups, done a lot of different things. Today, he works as a consultant, helping other companies solve hard technology problems. His company is called InsightSpin. You can check them out. We'll have a link in the show notes, I'm sure. Stephen, welcome to the show, man. So I guess my first question for you today is, why do software developers always struggle to understand the big picture?
Oh, wow. I don't think we have enough time to cover that one fully. Like many things, there's a lot of pressure to have short-term outcomes nowadays, even more so. That's true, worldwide, basically. I think in technology where it's so important to have a good long-term plan in place that you don't really appreciate the value of not having it until it's too late. And then you realize you're chasing your vision, you're chasing your plan, and you've made a lot of mistakes you have to keep recovering from. And then if you were to do it again, you would realize that you need to have a big picture in mind. The other thing that I find is actually pretty interesting, of course, is a lot of people view the big picture as a permanent stake in the ground, where when you have lots of good experiences working with teams, you realize, teams can revolve around a stake, but they can't revolve around nothing. So you have
Yeah.
to have a stake in the ground in order to have a way to do change management. And again, pivoting and rapid time to market and making the right choices and all that, is such an important part of business that a lot of companies don't perfect very well. And then when I come in, I'm often saying to people, like, it's obvious you don't have a plan. You're busy arguing about stuff where the answer is surfaced 12 times already in the meeting, but because you don't have the context to recognize the right decisions, you don't make them. And then you just keep going and going and chasing them. So, in many ways, it's not that necessarily they don't. I think the businesses don't often afford them the luxury of either taking the time to create it because they think it's a waste of time, or we'll just figure it out as we go. Both are wrong, typically.
Well, you mentioned getting everybody to agree to a plan. At that point, you're talking about the key stakeholders, the executives, the product management team, right? You're talking about not really the developers, but even the key stakeholders.
The key stakeholders. So, technology being what it is, key stakeholders, if you view all the different role leaders as the key stakeholders, they have a lot of challenge just communicating with each other anyways. The salesperson and the marketing person, agree and disagree about different things. So when you're trying to put a plan together, you really have to have the right formula at that table in order to be able to navigate how to put the plan in place and get the right buy-in without being driven to consensus. When you get the salesperson saying, don't worry, I'll just take care of it, that's not what you want. And when you got the engineer saying that, CTO or whatever, don't worry, just take care of it, you don't want that either, because both of those probably mean they're just doing their own thing. And it's hard. So, I know not to specifically focus on a personal experience, but when Platesman came together, we had a very balanced table at that leadership event. And when we were talking about our business, we all functioned really well together. We understood how to make the trade-offs. We all could communicate, partly because as its leader, I was very technical, so that did help. But we were able to sort of talk through our issues, pretty practically and rapidly to make decisions, and we had a lot of focus. That's another thing I find when I talk to companies is there's not a lot of evidence of people focusing on the same thing as you go through. And again, it's hard to operate. Take any analogy, sports team, football plays, military operations. They're all about focus and knowing the sequence of events and what to do next when something happens. But most businesses don't have those kinds of plans in place. So, you have to get together every day and refigure out what you want to do next. And it's, a colossal loss of time.
Well, I'm sure you have some stories about clients you work with that you help with these problems now, but to me, it feels like when you've got a lot of stakeholders and everybody has a lot of opinions, usually what you're missing is somebody who's really the final leader that makes the final decision that says, "Great, that was all great, everybody. I appreciate your opinions, but this is what we're going to do. Let's go." Right? Where in a corporate environment, that person a lot of times doesn't exist,
Right.
right? Is that the problem you see?
It is, but not maybe in exactly the way you said it, if you don't mind. Um, part of the challenge is, I often find myself telling people, if you're asking for input, you have to be ready to take input. If you're not ready to take input, all you're creating is disappointment. So if you go into a meeting and we say to somebody, we open it up, okay, we're going to talk about what we're going to do next year, and everybody's just going to free for all, you're not going to make anybody happy. So then you have to manage that team by trying to sort of force everybody to follow whatever the decision is, whether you make it or whether you draw it out of the collective input. Whereas the best sort of leadership approach often is I have to largely paint the path, and what I'm relying on you as the team is to refine it and rough out its edge or smooth out its rough edges, those sorts of things. If I come into a scenario not having any kind of framework for making a decision, then I'm just throwing it over into the group. And that's really hard because all the interpersonal issues come into play. And even the best of leaders, sometimes they don't want to be caught in a position of saying, that's all really great, but we're just going to do it this way, because you probably have alienated a number of people. And while some people are professional enough to say, hey, it's my job, I get paid to do this, this is what I'm going to do, they're going to do it with a little less passion than they might otherwise. So you want to get them to buy in. You want to sort of get into their head, which is why you have people like me involved sometimes to help get into their head to create the concept that can be used to make sure that if they're going to argue with you, at least they're arguing within the framework of the right direction, rather than trying to create another direction. Because that one's okay, that's healthy to say, we got to go to market through channels. We've all agreed on that, so let's argue that one out, and you get some pros and cons about it. But you're not throwing out the initial premise, which if you did, then again, you're two steps backwards, and that's not helpful.
Well, this is a difficult balance because, like, as a CEO, or executive leader, you don't want to tell everybody what to do, right? You want everybody's input as part of the process. You want them to feel like they have some ownership in the decisions that were made, and they're going to be ultimately the ones that help carry out the things. But then in a lot of companies, you have somebody who isn't driving the overall direction, right? You've got a lot of people with opinions, but nobody's willing to be the person to take the risk, right? Of like, no, this is what we're going to do. So inevitably, I think in a lot of large companies, you get a lot of stakeholders that just don't want to make a decision because they're scared of the risk of making the decision.
Right.
And then in a startup, they make too many decisions that none of the decisions have enough time to play out. So it's like both ends of the spectrum, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, in the smaller case, focus is important. So I've been involved in a couple of businesses that needed to be resurrected. And usually the problem, and I'm actually actively helping another one out now, and usually the problem is lack of focus, too many ideas at the beginning, they easily get distracted. They make the mistake of talking to customers a little too early so that they get further distracted. And they end up delivering a tactical implementation of their original vision, and they don't yet then have much progress made on the larger, oomph they want to bring to market. So I've seen that problem a number of times. In my own situation with Platespin, it started out of a bankruptcy, and that was one of the choices we made. It was trying to do, one thing with 100 tentacles. We picked one tentacle, did it really, really well, and became globally dominant with it, and then expanded out from there. And I think that was a very helpful thing because to our earlier topic, the whole team understood the one thing we were doing, so
Yeah.
we were able to align and orient around it quite successfully. I think, like product leaders, the sort of chief product officer type, their role is largely to stand in the middle and take the brunt of this is what we're doing as much as they can. The CEO or whoever the equivalent is, they have a charter from their investors if that's how they got the business together. So, one of those two people have to be responsible for, at least in general, saying, here's the North Star or here's the 100,000-foot view, and then work with the team to just navigate the path through the forest to get to the other end, to keep using metaphors. Because if they don't do that, then we're back to where we were earlier. We're just trying to manage a business by consensus, and you can't do that, at least in the
Yeah.
overview. Like anything, typical group is very short-term focused when you start doing consensus discussion.
Well, so you've been doing this for a very long time. You've seen a lot of startups, had a lot of success of yourself. How do you see AI changing all of this stuff now? How is it changing our roles and some of these dynamics? To me, it almost feels like it's going to make them worse because it's like if we can innovate faster, it's the speed of the decision making that is ultimately the bottleneck. But we suck at that. Like that's the part I
Yeah.
feel like we're the worst at.
Yeah. Not too many businesses have good airbags to protect you from crashing into the wall. Unfortunately, it's a multifaceted question in so many respects. I think, AI by role, it's easier to talk about it than more generally. But what I have found, given you said I've done this for a long time, when I look at the industry over my career, what I was part of is many transformational technologies coming in. AI is, let's for the moment just say, another one of them. Now, obviously, it may have more material impact ultimately. The spreadsheet, when it came in, was a transformational technology, changed a lot of roles. Finance had to work differently. Some of the low end jobs disappeared. You changed how you did budgeting, but you had to learn where the sharp edges were on that tool in order to not create bad financial reports. You go back earlier, the calculator would have been that same example, right? People were doing everything by hand or by those manual paper tape thingies. Now they could just carry it around with them, a bit of a big device early on, but those were transformational. So in my mind, I think the most obvious thing you can do with AI is realize it's like adding somebody to your team. And if you start with that, it's a really good starting place. It's like having Stephen Pollack in all your meetings. He can be available 24 hours a day. He'll answer whatever question you ask. There's no personality to it. There's no it performs the same way all the time. But even if you work with somebody like me, you have to know how to interact with me in order to get the most out of me. So if you don't bother to learn how to interact with me well, you won't necessarily get the best out of me. But unlike AI, I'm not, the AI doesn't go further than you ask it. Whereas if you engage me, I'm going to proactively go further if I see some gaps. So unless you ask it to do that, it's not going to do that. So to me, that's one of the messages that's useful to understand is treat it like it's in your it's a private member of your team, and just interact with it exactly as you would. Don't be embarrassed that you're fixing up your punctuation and doing proper sentence and grammar when you're doing your prompts. It's good practice anyways. There's no reason that you need to do that because it's quite capable of deducing what you're saying. But treat it that way. I think that's helpful. When you get into vertical uses like coding, that's where I think some of the dangers are, because while it's very, very adept at generating interesting intellectual property because it could do coding, coding is a language. So if it can do English, it could do C++ and it could do PHP and it can do Python scripting. But that's not where the risk is in most companies. The risk is typically not the initial creation of your innovation, it's the maintenance of it in the market. It's how you grow it, how you add to it, how you make it more valuable, all those sorts of things. And that's a swirl of business activity typically. So if I get it to build my MVP, more power to it. I can do that really fast. Good for proof of concept, good to get some ideas. But now as I start to make changes, I've got to tie sales in, I've got to tie support in, I've got to tie a whole bunch of things in. That's challenging. So there's roles to play for people who use AI to help make some of that smoother. My documentation project, the one I did the presentation on last week, was one dimension of that. How do we dramatically reduce the cost of documentation in our projects so that we could spend more time producing quality output? And I've been trying to work through how to use AI for that, because most of the time, you do it all at the beginning because I have to get to market with a manual that shows how my product works. But then once I release my product, I kind of let it devolve into just a lot of bad documentation because it's too expensive, just like code. It's too expensive to go find the one sentence that's wrong in it somewhere and make a change because I've added a new feature. Maybe the original writer is not there anymore, so they're the only ones who know the content really well. Or I wait for customers to complain, which some people say, look at that, we're really on top of all our P1s. Right, but by definition, every event is an unhappy event. The customer is reaching out to you because of something that's missing, doesn't work, they don't like. That's not a positive thing. It's positive that you respond, but it's not positive that you've let it get so late in that cycle. Because if they don't call you, you could lose them to a competitor before you realize it. So AI is a lot of interesting things, and it definitely has a strong place to play. But it's got a lot of sharp edges, and that's what I've been trying to explore is where those sharp edges are and start revealing them so you can use them properly. The product role is a very interesting place for me with AI because it's mostly about creating artifacts and knowledge, or it's a knowledge worker role. And its weakness often is synthesizing the right input to produce the right output. Whereas AI has an insatiable capability to synthesize input. So if a product manager does a good job in bringing all the inputs together, it's a lot easier for AI to sort of synthesize it into something the product manager can make final decisions with. And that's incredibly valuable for businesses. And then to do it in such a way that lets the engineers interact with it so long-term direction is understood so they make less, tax decisions that, shortcoming decisions, then they can use that knowledge base the product manager owns. So I really like AI in that particular role. It's not as clear in some of the other ones, but it's a leveling up, but it's not a leveling up to excellence. It's a leveling up to average for
Well,
both.
I love that idea of how could you use AI to build sort of a virtual product manager that sort of gets back to not trying to replace the product manager, but also help everyone involved around like how is this supposed to work? Why did we build the product this way? Sort of your point of some of your documentation too. It's like how do I feed into it all of this knowledge and background about why things are the way they are?
Yeah.
Which honestly, a lot of it could be like consuming a bunch of Jira tickets or, other documentation, right? And like building it up into this sort of knowledge base that you could go ask questions about, like, why did we build this thing? Why is this feature this work this way? Who uses this feature? Who asked for the feature? Whatever. Because nobody knows. Like, eventually, all that tribal knowledge is gone. And then you're like, well, we just are doing things the way that we've always done them, and
Right.
we don't even know why we do them this way.
Yeah, so you also can neutralize a little bit of the retention issue in a team, right? Where a key person leaves after a while, and that personal knowledge goes. In the coding example, of course, that's obvious. That's typically a really bad one if a senior coder leaves. There's a lot of nuances in your implementations that often are tied to that person. Um, but if you, what's a good example? Like a topic I recently presented to a company was how to rebalance being customer driven versus innovation driven. They were way too customer driven, and they were, 90% of their sprint cycles were based on responding to the top tickets, which they have to respond to, but they never took any time to actually advance the differentiation of their product and build their, competitive mode out better. So they're increasingly getting nailed by their competitors. Part of it is it's hard to synthesize that. So if again you go to AI and you say, okay, my goal is I want 40% of my time on customer focused issues, here's the current ticket log, and I want 60% on innovation, here's what our product currently does, here's my innovation statement. How would you recommend we implement the balance? You'd get an output that you could look at and make
Yeah.
decisions around, which is way beyond what a lot of running at full steam product managers have time to do. So AI plays a really great role there, and you just give it those parameters, and it will give you at least something you could start working on rather than just picking something out of the sky. It's very easy to focus on P1s because you've got salespeople lobbying for them, even the marketing people to some degree lobbying for them. So the internal voice is really strong to do things that are attached to customers. But a good business person realizes they've already paid, so they're not going to pay again. They're already in your revenue cycle. You don't want to lose them, but you don't have to treat them ahead of getting the next new customer. In fact, arguably you shouldn't. And people forget that, and it's too late when a young upstart comes and starts to steal their business, and then that's often what they do is they focus on the things you didn't do as they
Yeah.
get into that customer.
So going back to the AI product manager thing for a minute, I think it makes a lot of sense to be able to use some kind of knowledge base to do that. But the role of a product manager and product management in general is still the super high level strategic. Like, why are we building what we're building? I don't think AI is ever going to replace that part of it.
Well, I don't know that it needs to replace it, but you could ask it better questions looking for the openings. We compete with these 5 products. Here's their specs. Where's a good area do you think we can have impact on a customer? And here's the kind of customer we're targeting. It could give you some good insight into that, which is, what a really good product manager can often do off the top of their head. But those are not easy people to find, right? The top of the pyramid people are uncommon. So most product teams are made up of, I'll call them average people, no insult intended to the audience, but that's pretty common that they're average. So AI can help raise those people, but they have to know how to ask the questions correctly. They have to know how to assemble the input they're providing in order to get the right output. And that's what I've been finding with this doc project. It's surprisingly, I can create quite a lot of value change in the output for my articles based on how I present the input and what I ask it to do. It's also very flexible. I was actually quite surprised um, how much control I have over the output it produces and what format and everything else. So it's got also lots of interesting side effects that you don't have to spend a lot of time massaging the output. But I have to ask it, with a very, very careful use of language to shape the response I get back. And that, so-called prompt engineering jobs, but you don't want to necessarily be a pro at the, the language, but not the domain. So you need the product manager to also be really good at prompt engineering in order to interact with things like ChatGPT correctly.
I want to go back to something else you mentioned for a minute, and that's the struggle that companies have of being customer driven versus sort of innovation driven. And that very much feels like the problem of every established company. And so, actually, one of my last companies I sold 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, it has an established product, but the product, we'll say, needs a lot of help. It needs a lot of kind of rewriting. It needs to evolve. But they're so stuck in the way of what they do things now that they have just no concept of like, well, potentially, do we need to burn down what we have and go start something new? And it feels like almost every product eventually gets that, right? Like there's a certain form of like age, technical debt, maintenance, whatever, where a product goes to what somebody refers to as shitification, where eventually that's just kind of how the product ends up. But then nobody has the will to sort of stop enhancing this turd that they keep polishing. Does that make sense?
Glad you used that word at the end. Uh, absolutely. Again, I hate to say what's the right way to say that. It is a willpower challenge that I would typically blame the leadership team on as you go through the grow up exercise from being a startup to getting to the middle to getting to market. You have to maintain the discipline at every step to keep focused on your North Star, or you tend to just fall down to the problems you just described. Aside from there can be, again, transformational designs like website design is a good example. Now we've got all these funny panel things that people like me just hate, but that's the way to do it. So everybody's got to redesign their websites because they're not that easy to change based on the tools you use to build them. But in coding, back to where we started, without that bigger picture in mind, without taking the time at the beginning to map out what I would call your plan to be successful, I've run into a lot of companies that have inherently within their plan a lack of planning for success. Like we'll worry about a lot of users when we get them. We'll worry about performance when we have that problem. We'll worry about that sort of thing when we have that problem. So they don't realize that you can't solve that problem well at that point in time typically. And it ends up taking up more and more of your overall budget to deal with those issues than it does to satisfy your desire to be innovative still. So you just move off that path gradually. It's just a discipline thing. It's very hard. It's not an easy discipline to maintain. You have to have a lot of conviction from your leaders, a lot of buy-in to the vision that they have, and a lot of oversight to take a moment to make sure that this thing leads to the next thing you're trying to do and not say, I don't have time to think about that. Because I find that's the biggest issue. So you wind up in the path here, like not to name examples, but like Salesforce, I think is a great example of a behemoth product with lots of customers, considered still world dominant, and it's a terrible product.
Yeah.
And it's impossible for them to change it, right?
Yeah.
I've had such weird feedback from them around, I can't get it to do this, and their reply was, well, don't try. Well, what kind of answer is that?
Yeah.
And specifically to me, that's the wrong answer. But like my God, like I'm trying to imagine how they've designed it, and all I could think of underneath, because of the technical experience, is they've probably gone that way instead of this way. Like, why did they not plan to be successful? So now I think they're in that example where if they don't want to have somebody ultimately eat their lunch, it'll be interesting to see whether things like AI-based CRM tools will eat their lunch. they have to start again to a large degree and realize that they missed the boat on a few things. They're
Well,
also
it
very complicated products.
kind of comes circle to the beginning of our conversation, right? Where we have all these stakeholders in the room, and nobody wants to make that hard decision.
Right.
They're scared of the risk of doing
Right.
it, and now all of a sudden, some form of market influence is going to force it.
Yeah.
Like which could be also decline in market share or something else, or like a new owner comes in or
Yeah.
something like that that all of a sudden forces these dynamics. But even like my first company that I built from 2003 to 2011, if you look at that software today, it looks 90% the same.
Yeah.
Like they have changed so little about it. And it's a market dominating product. It's number one in its industry, but they're scared to change it. They've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users. They don't want to make the users mad. They don't want to change it. They don't want to move the button. They don't want to change the color of the button.
Yeah.
But eventually a competitor comes by and eats their lunch.
Well, so Matt, that's an interesting one, because there's a part of me that also says, that's a good thing because if you believe in, crossing the chasm, when you're a leader, the community you're servicing doesn't want you to go away. They don't want you
Yeah.
to disrupt things. They rely on you for certain things. So the question only is if a competitor is going to come in and somehow steal that customer base, um, either they haven't been successful in creating, a dependent integration into their workflows of that product, because that makes it somewhat easy to displace, or there's no possibility to introduce the gap features, but that's typically less likely. They just have to think about that a little harder to get the features that somebody else could choose to go after. It's not that easy because, as you say, I've been using their product for 8 years, like Salesforce, using their product for 8 years. I can't imagine taking all my data out and redoing all my dashboards and redoing all my CRM formulas and everything else and putting it into some other system. And even if you create some quasi import export, it's going to be hard to get companies to buy into that. But it's needed because they're not servicing the new things that are needed in ways that people want. My InsightSpin website, I kind of laugh with some people. It's a hand coded website. There's no infrastructure, no website tools in it like WordPress or anything like that. I pay the minimal virtual hosting fee for it, and it's the fastest website I know because it's just there's no
Yeah.
obstacles. I don't really want to change it because I don't know that I need to. It's not the best example because it's not a business application. It's just knowledge. But it functions, it clicks, it's immediately responsive. It's got all the characteristics of a good website, even though it's got an old style. Like I laugh, who cares what style it is? I'm an old style. Who cares? As long as it's got good content on it. So that's what I'm more concerned about. But when you get into the business apps, I find I like going in and finding creative ways to get you from where you are to where you want to be. There
Yeah.
always are. There always are. And it's easier for an outsider to do that because they're not pressed with the baggage that the whole team has. So you come in.
There's so much sunk cost fallacy that kind of spoils the team, right? They're like, we've
Absolutely.
been doing this
Absolutely.
forever. We work so hard on this. We
Yeah.
can't stop doing it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's the ways of doing it. So change is not easy. Teams don't like that, but the being dynamic, building a business from the ground up, saying we're going to be responsive and flexible to our own ideas, not just the market, is a very valuable feature to have in a business when you first start. So you have to recruit teams that know how to work that way. And again, that's not the normal way of working. And then what do you do when you get really big? You have to avoid the problem of being really big, where, how does a company lay off 10,000 people all of a sudden? Well, they've got 1,000 groups and each group's laying off 10 people. It's not a lot to each group, but it adds up because they're so big.
Yeah.
So how do you get that far that quickly? It's a mystery. But we grew PlateSpin to about 225 people, and we never, for the most part, lost any of our original way of working because it was in our culture to be focused and on time with delivery and on time with our business plans and all that. But we hired with that in mind, and that was important.
Well, I really appreciate having you on the show today. For those who want to learn more about you and your background and maybe how you could help them, what can you share?
Yeah, so a lot of my sort of experience and notes are on insightspin.com. So it's an open website, no fees or anything to get at it. It's organized by operational roles. So if you're a product person or an engineer or a salesperson or whatever, you go to the website, you pick your operating discipline, and you go read the articles. And it talks about some of the different challenges you have and suggests different ways to stage them. And then I can be sort of engaged in some fashion, excuse me, to coach, mentor, or step in on a fractional basis into any of those roles pretty much. And then work with your business. And I've got a lot of business experience, a lot of markets, been part of some global successes and help resurrect some failures and I been around a lot and then more recently focused a lot on AI. So I think I'm a really good person to come in and sort of help give that outsider's push to get the right things done and just figure it out. Companies aren't planning to be successful, and that's the kind of stuff I love to help companies with.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Matt, and enjoy the rest of winter if anybody's out there with snow like we are.
All right. Thank you.
See ya. Bye.
Before we wrap up today's episode, we have a special resource for you if you're looking to elevate your development team to have more of a product-driven mindset. I have a fantastic free ebook about turning your code-first team into a product-first team. Please go to fullscaleteam.com/product-first-teams to download this free ebook. There's also a link in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Product Driven, and we'll see you in the next episode.